Welcome back. Pope planned, councils agreed, and a province changed. What is the single most overlooked place or community in the Pueblo Revolt story, Taos Zuni Hopi, or another town you think we should cover? Tell us where to focus next. August 1680, New Mexico. Along the Rio Grande and out toward Zuni and the Hopi Mesas, Pueblo towns live under the institutions of New Spain. Missions direct worship and schooling. Civil authority sits at Santa Fe under the governor. Tribute and labor drafts bind fields and workshops to the provincial economy. Kivas have been torn down in past years. Medicine men have been punished as idolaters. Drought and raids have strained stores. Investigations and arrests have multiplied since the mid-1670s. The principal actors are clear. Pueblo communities plan and decide in council. A planner and messenger network centers on Pope of Ohkay Owingeh. The provincial government is led by Governor Antonio de Otermin. Franciscan clergy hold influence at mission compounds from Taos to Zuni. Small garrisons and militia companies guard roads and settlements, but are spread thin across long distances. The stakes are concrete. If Pueblo coordination fails, isolated towns face punishment and renewed suppression of ceremony. If coordination holds, Spanish rule in the north may break at least for a season. Communications are the hinge. Runners move between towns with a simple code that sets time for action and preserves secrecy. The guiding question is direct. What mix of religious suppression, forced labor, and drought pressure produced a shared decision for revolt across many languages and valleys? How did the chosen signals and timing overcome the advantage of Spanish firearms and horses? Why did the effort succeed at Santa Fe and hold long enough to alter the balance of power for years? By the late 1670s, the structure of New Spain in the north was fixed. Missions directed worship and schooling. Tribute and labor drafts tied Pueblo fields and workshops to colonial needs. Civil authority sat at Santa Fe under the governor. Religious suppression was sustained. Kivas had been torn down. Ceremonies were policed. Medicine men faced public punishment. These long pressures shaped a common grievance, even where languages differed. Environmental stress narrowed choices. Drought years reduced maize and beans. Herds and wild foods ran thin. Raids on border settlements rose, and reprisals followed. The burden of guarding roads and moving supplies fell on Pueblo carriers, as well as on small militia detachments. Scarcity turned discipline harsher in mission towns. A decisive prelude came in 1675. Authorities seized Pueblo spiritual leaders. Some were flogged. Several were executed. Demands for release of prisoners forced a confrontation. The episode confirmed that local petitions could not secure lasting relief. From that moment, councils looked beyond petition to coordination. By 1679, planners began to test a method to link distant towns. Runners would carry a cord with knots. Each knot marked a day to action. The code did not need writing. It traveled by foot from valley to valley. Meetings were held away from mission compounds. When needed, Spanish served as a practical bridge language across nations. The aim was to set a single week for local strikes and then amass around Santa Fe. Pueblo objectives were direct. End forced labor tied to mission and civil orders. Restore ceremony in kivas and plazas. Remove garrisons and friars from Pueblo country. Constraints were real. Powder and firearms were scarce. Horses were rare. Distances were long, and messengers could be seized. Planting and harvest could not stop for long without bringing hunger. Spanish objectives were continuity and control. Keep the mission system intact, protect colonists and converts. Hold the line of towns from Taos to Isleta, and watch the western missions at Zuni and Hopi. Constraints were also sharp. Garrison numbers were low. Supply caravans up the Camino Real were infrequent and slow. Communications rested on couriers and orders carried by hand. Through early 1680, the cords moved. Councils counted down and sent the runner on. The plan depended on secrecy and simultaneity. If discovery came, late towns would rise one day early rather than risk loss of surprise. The province stood on the edge of a coordinated choice. Early August 1680 heat lay over the Rio Grande. Thunderheads built over the Jemez and Sangre de Cristo ranges and broke in brief evening rain. In the north, Tewa and Tano councils confirmed the countdown. In the Querez towns to the west, messengers arrived by night and left at first light. At Zuni and on the Hopi, Mesa's leaders agreed to the plan and warned that local garrisons would fall only if timing held. Signals moved on foot. A runner entered a plaza and placed a cord with knots before the council. One knot would be untied at dawn each day. When the last knot vanished, action would begin. The code was simple and hard to intercept. When distant towns needed a shared language for final instructions, they used Spanish as a practical bridge. The cords crossed rivers and mesas in a week, then a delay and a shock. In the south, Spanish patrols seized 2 youths carrying a cord. Under questioning, the meaning of the knots became clear. The news pushed the plan forward by a day to protect surprise. Runners moved again with the urgent change. In towns nearest Santa Fe, watchmen signaled to prepare at once. On August 10th, the first strikes fell on mission compounds. At San Marcos and Galisteo to the south of Santa Fe, Pueblo fighters barred gates, seized weapons, and isolated friars. In the north, at Tesuque and Powak, roads were cut and horse lines taken. Settlers fled toward the capital. Couriers from the governor tried to reach outlying posts and were turned back. The palace courtyard filled with families and wagons. Powder and food were counted. The well and the acequia were guarded. At Pecos to the east, the council held the road through the canyon, while messengers rode along the backbone of the province to Zuni and toward the Hopi mesas. In the middle Rio Grande, some Tiwa and Piro towns did not join and tried to stay clear of the fighting. The rising was broad, but not identical everywhere. A short voice from the records captures the design and its goal. Naranjo, Declaration, Santa Fe, 1681. At a designated time, the Indians were to rise against the Spaniards in their own towns, and then gather to capture the Spanish capital of Santa Fe. Runners passed from pueblo to pueblo with cords with knots, which they untied day by day until the day of the uprising. By sunset, smoke rose from mission yards along several valleys. Spanish riders gathered at the palace. The siege of the capital was now possible. ChatGPT Danoy. The first week after the rising began, the province moved toward 2 centers of gravity. In the north, Pueblo fighters closed on Santa Fe. In the west, Zuni and the Hopi mesas broke the power of their mission compounds and held their own ground. The Spanish side concentrated every available soldier and settler family in and around the palace of the governors. Governor Antonio de Otermin tried to impose order in narrow lanes now crowded with carts, livestock, and makeshift barricades. Powder was measured in small horns. Lead was cast in kitchen molds. Children carried water in jars from the acequia that crossed the plaza edge. The town was never a fortress. Its strength was habit and distance, not walls. That habit had been broken. Order of forces can be sketched without romance. Otermin had militia captains drawn from colonist families, a handful of trained soldiers and town companies stiffened by older veterans who remembered earlier campaigns. The Franciscans inside the palace precinct urged prayer and penance. On the Pueblo side, the field was not a single army, but converging town companies. Tewa and Tano fighters held the northern approaches and the heights. Querez companies pressed from the west along the road that led toward the river crossings. To the south, fighters from Galisteo and San Marcos blocked lanes and irrigation channels. At dawn and dusk, the 2 sides watched each other across low walls, gardens, and corrals. At midday, heat kept both to shade. The rules of engagement hardened into simple facts. Inside the palace compound, the priority was to keep non-combatants under cover and to reserve powder for close fights. Outside the palace, Pueblo leaders sought to close all paths in and out and to deny water. When skirmishers tried to probe toward the acequia, they met a quick rush from the Spanish line and fell back only to return as the day cooled. No one wasted shots on long ranges. Fire came close around street corners and over low walls. The cutting of the acequia was the central move. The channel that carried water into the palace precinct crossed ground that was not defensible in depth. Pueblo workers who knew every bend put hoes and mattocks to the task under cover of skirmish lines. When the flow slackened in the palace basins late on the second day, Otermin understood the scale of his problem. Food could be stretched for a time. Without water in August, the clock would run fast against the town. An early sally bought hours, not relief. A door at the rear of the compound swung open, and a knot of mounted men pushed out on the narrow street, followed by footmen with pike axes and a few matchlocks. They drove the nearest skirmishers away from the ditch and knocked down a hasty barricade built from doors and cart frames. But the open ground beyond was already covered by bowmen and men with captured muskets. One horse went down. The small Spanish wedge bent back toward the gate before being cut off. The door admitted them again and clanged shut. Dust hung in the air and settled slowly. The acequia repair proved temporary. By nightfall, the flow was weak again, and the ditch farther upstream was broken in two places. In the west, Zuni and Hopi towns moved in their own rhythms. At Zuni, fighters surrounded the mission compound and pulled down the bell. At the Hopi mesas, steep trails were held by men who knew each handhold and each ledge. Friars and soldiers found themselves at the end of a long supply line stretched past towns no longer willing to carry loads. Churches came down there too. The effect on Santa Fe was indirect but decisive. No help would come from the west, and messages could not pass through as before. The middle Rio Grande held its own complexity. Not all towns joined. Some Tiwa and Piro communities south of the capital tried to avoid being drawn into the rising and moved people to safer ground near fields and river islands. The lines on any later map would be too clean for what happened. The revolt was coordinated, but not uniform. That unevenness was a strength as well as a sign of the real world. There was no single center that could be taken to break the movement. Each mission was its own contested place, and to move forces from one to the other cost time and water. By the fourth day at Santa Fe, the Spanish position had narrowed to survival and calculation. Otermin convened the captains, the notary, and elders. They marked on a table the streets they could still move through the wells within reach, and the food remaining. The question was whether to try a decisive charge to drive the Pueblos back from the acequia and wells, or to prepare a breakout south along the river road. The first course risked leaving non-combatants exposed and the column cut in pieces. The second offered a chance to gather survivors at Isleta and move on to El Paso del Norte, but conceded the capital. The horizon gave no sign of relief dust from the south. Two short voices recorded later frame what the papers say without embroidery. Otermin/order extract, Santa Fe, year August 1680. By reason of the want of water and provisions and the multitude of enemies surrounding us all, the people must prepare to depart in a body by the road of the river to seek relief. Naranjo Declaration, Santa Fe, 1681. After the siege, the Spaniards went away from the kingdom, and the Indians were left without friars or Spaniards. Between those lines of record, the next days were a series of small fights for alleys and gates. Pueblo fighters learned the palace routine and timed probes when shade reached certain walls. Spanish sentries learned to listen for the scrape of adobe moved at night to make fresh firing steps. Muskets flashed at close range. Arrows thudded into doors hung as shields across windows. A stray spark ignited a thatch and was beaten out with wet hides. A mule fell in the courtyard and lay where it fell. Children were moved by hand from one room to another as sun and threat shifted. The most precious cargo was water carried in big jars from a source within the compound that could not meet all needs. Ration lines formed twice a day and were measured in ladles. Away from the capital, skirmishes cut couriers on the road. A message sent south for help did not return. Packs of dogs followed refugee groups and colonists from outlying settlements who had slipped past the first set of roadblocks and now camped near the town edge under guard. A small detachment sent to bring in a family from a nearby ranch arrived to find the place burned and returned with only a cart of flour that had been overlooked in a collapsed room. Each such errand cost powder and men's strength that could not be replaced. Casualty figures for these days are uneven in the records. Spanish tallies across the province record the deaths of friars at multiple missions and scores of settlers in the first week of the rising. Pueblo deaths around Santa Fe and at Western missions are not counted with the same detail by Spanish hands. Later, community memory holds the names and places with care even where paper does not. Fact sits beside folklore here. Stories of a single signal sent by a hawk or a bell that rang by itself to start the attack cannot be confirmed. The chords and the countdown are documented. The method worked because it was simple and could be repeated without writing. As the siege lengthened, logistics dominated choices. Powder needed dry storage and careful use. Food could be stretched with pinoles and meat from animals that could not be kept. Water could not be stretched. The acequia was the lever because it was public and visible and vulnerable. Each attempt to reopen it brought a fight. Each hour it stayed cut shortened the time the town could stand. The decision to break south became inevitable once the ditch could not be held. Preparation for the breakout had to be made under pressure. Carts were repaired with rawhide lashings. Oxen were yoked. Families were assigned to wagons or to walking units that would keep to the inside of the column. The remaining horses were grouped at the head and rear under the best shots. Powder was divided by company. The order of march was laid out in a courtyard with stones to mark positions. A signal was agreed for forming a circle around a wagon if the head of the column was checked in narrow ground. Scouts who knew the river paths were brought in and questioned about fords islands and places where the road could be easily blocked. Dawn on the chosen day brought a brittle quiet. Pueblo skirmishers kept their places, not yet certain that the town would attempt flight. The gates opened, and the head of the column pushed out. Women and men carried bundles that held iron pots, blankets, seed corn, and small icons. Children walked and were lifted when dust or stones cut their feet. The first 100 paces were the most dangerous. If the encircling fighters chose to close, then panic could shatter the formation. Instead, the attackers harried the flanks and fell back to new walls. The Spanish horse made short rushes to clear corners, then returned to the side of the moving people. At the river, the crossing became the second hinge. The fordable places were known to both sides. Pueblo fighters moved to take positions that could rake the road with arrows and musket fire as the wagons sank to their hubs. The column did not halt longer than the time needed to keep wheels from bogging. Men with poles pushed at the hubs and called time to rock wagons free. On the far bank, women laid out children to breathe while men formed a hasty line until the rear guard crossed. A stray wagon tipped and was righted by a surge of hands. One mule was cut loose rather than lose the team. The line dressed again and moved south on the river road. Through the next days, the column fought small actions at choke points, where bluffs crowded the road or where the river bent close against low hills. Pueblo fighters did not need to stop the movement entirely to make it bleed. A few shots and a flurry of arrows would force the rear guard to form a square around a wagon and bring the line to a halt. An hour later, the same thing would happen at a new place. The point of the pressure was not to annihilate the moving people in the open. It was to ensure that they did not dare return to the capital and to keep them from stripping fields as they passed. In that aim, the harrying succeeded. Back in Santa Fe, smoke rose from buildings that had been the seats of Spanish authority. Pueblo workers took down beams from mission structures and carried them to rebuild kivas. The plaza changed meaning. Bells were silenced or removed. The quiet after the column left did not mean all danger was past for the towns. The season still demanded planting and harvesting. The drought did not lift because the garrison had gone. Coordination now had to turn to food ceremony and keeping watch to the south where any attempted return would first show. At Zuni and the Hopi mesas, the pattern also settled. Mission compounds remained empty. Trails were watched by men on ledges who had no interest in distant politics beyond the security of their towns and fields. The removal of friars and soldiers was less a campaign in columns than a reassertion of local control with the strength to make it stick. Oral histories there remember the practical work of guarding paths and dismantling structures more than distant speeches. South of Santa Fe, the retreating column reached Isleta and gathered more people who had held out in small clusters in hope that the storm would pass. With numbers now larger than the town could support, the line moved again toward El Paso del Norte. The road was long and dry. Falling behind meant being lost on the road or being taken by raiders from outside the province who had no interest in the lines of the revolt and saw only a moving wealth of animals and carts. When at last the column reached the settlements at the river border, officials there counted heads, made lists, and began to plan what they called a reconquest. Those plans would take years to ripen. It is worth pausing on a point where fact and folklore are often tangled. Later stories sometimes make Pope a single commander who ordered every move across the province. The record supports a different picture. Pope was a planner, a messenger, and a symbol of unity to many councils. He was not a general with a map and a command chain in the European sense. The strength of the revolt was that each town could decide and act under a shared signal without waiting for orders from a distant tent. That is why the loss of any one leader would not have broken the movement, and why the arrest of runners only forced the timing forward instead of ending the plan. By the time the dust of the retreat had settled on the southern road, and by the time smoke no longer rose from the palace, the confrontation phase had achieved its objective. Spanish rule in New Mexico was ended in practice. Towns that had lived for decades under mission and civil compulsion now set their own calendars again. Kivas rose where churches had stood. Water flowed by Pueblo decision. The province did not become peaceful or simple. Border raids did not stop with a change in flags. Drought still bit. But for 12 years, there were no Spanish officials in Santa Fe to order arrests for ceremony or to send labor drafts up and down the valley. One after-action note from the Spanish side recorded in later compilations reads with a plainness that carries weight beyond its few words. Anonymous Spanish official report, Abstract El Paso del Norte, Latte, 1680. We were compelled to leave the kingdom for want of water and provisions, the enemy being in great numbers. That line returns the reader to the basic mechanics that decided the confrontation. The revolt succeeded at Santa Fe because it made the old capital unlivable by simple means. It controlled the water. It cut roads. It refused to offer a single field battle that a small mounted garrison could win. The fight was not won by storming high walls with ladders, but by measuring days and knots, by placing men on ditches and alleys, and by holding nerve as the garrison chose the only path left open and went south. The turning point came when the acequia to the palace ran dry. It was a material fact that reset every choice. Without water, the garrison could not stand. Powder still sparked. Food still sat in sacks. But thirst set a hard limit. Pueblo fighters controlled the ditch upstream. They knew each bend. They put tools to mud and kept watch with bows and captured muskets. Inside the walls, Governor Antonio de Otermin counted jars and looked south. The question became when to depart, not whether to hold. Who and where and when are plain. Santa Fe in the second week of August 1680. Pueblo companies from Tewa and Tano towns held the northern lanes. Querés fighters pressed from the west. Men from Galisteo and San Marcos watched the south gates and the gardens near the ditch. Otermin's objective was survival of civilians and soldiers. Pueblo objectives were to deny water pin the garrison and force withdrawal. Constraints framed both sides. Pueblo powder was finite and horses were few. Spanish powder was also finite, and no relief could reach the capital before wells failed. The immediate effect was initiative shift. The garrison lost freedom to choose a decisive sortie. The siege gained time. Each hour without water increased the cost of staying. A short admission against interest appears in later copies of Spanish papers. Anonymous Spanish official report, Abstract El Paso del Norte, Latte, 1680. We were compelled to leave the kingdom for want of water and provisions, the enemy being in great numbers. That line does not mention courage or theology. It names water and numbers. It shows how planning met geography. The knotted cord had synchronized openings across the province. The cut ditch translated that coordination into a local mechanism of victory. A brief counterfactual helps to mark the hinge. If the acequia had remained open under Spanish control, Otermin might have held for weeks. He could have rationed food and kept families under cover while sending small parties to fetch forage. Relief from the south would still have been uncertain, but time would have belonged to the defenders. If the early arrest of runners had shattered coordination, the revolt might have broken into isolated town fights that a mounted garrison could beat in detail. Neither condition held. The ditch was cut. The cord counted down across valleys. Human cost followed both paths. In the first week, friars died at missions to the northwest and along the middle Rio Grande. Settlers died on roads as they tried to reach the capital. Pueblo men died in ditches and lanes under close fire. After the breakout south, the column lost animals and people to heat wounds and raids along the river road. Names are uneven in paper record. Winter count motifs and later oral accounts keep specific memory where lists do not. The turning point returns the story to structural pressures set out before the rising. Decades of suppression of ceremony made the rebuilding of kivas non-negotiable. Labor drafts tied to missions and civil orders made removal of garrisons a first goal. Drought sharpened the will to act by narrowing subsistence margins. The communications method, simple and resilient, allowed many languages and councils to move as one without waiting for a single commander. At Santa Fe, the same logic applied in small. A ditch was a shared artery. Control of that artery answered more than any single clash in an alley. When the column finally filed out and took the river road, the initiative passed fully to Pueblo towns. The palace no longer housed the power of New Spain in the north. For 12 years, there would be no friar or governor in Santa Fe to order arrests for ceremony or to draft carriers for convoys. The turning point was not a charge that broke a line. It was a community act that starved a fortress that was never built to be one. Spanish administration ended in practice the day the column reached the river road and moved south toward El Paso del Norte. In the north, mission ledgers and civil records fall silent. Councils in Pueblo towns resumed open authority. Churches that had dominated plazas were dismantled. Kivas were rebuilt with beams taken from mission roofs. Fields were replanted under community schedules. At Zuni and on the Hopi mesas, the pattern held. Steep trails were guarded. Mission compounds stayed empty. Local leaders directed watch posts and water use without outside orders. In the south, officials counted refugees and compiled returns. Lists of families, cattle, and wagons were entered for rations and planning. From those papers grew a policy to recover New Mexico. In 1681 to 1682, a reconnaissance north under Antonio de Otermin met resistance and withdrew. Through the later 1680s, correspondence from El Paso del Norte set out aims for a return built on both negotiation and arms. The road up the river valley remained long and dangerous. Supply trains were thin. The distance gave Pueblo towns time to rebuild and to test how to live without colonists or friars. Land and resource control shifted. Herds left behind by colonists were redistributed or driven south. Irrigation ditches were cleared and reworked by Pueblo labor for Pueblo fields. Timber once cut for churches went into roofs for homes and kivas. Trails were patrolled by men who knew each bend of mesa and arroyo. Where drought-pressed towns shared stored maize through kin ties, demography moved sharply. Refugee counts at the southern settlements rose as groups from outlying ranches, and some allied towns chose the road to safety. In the north, population was measured in local memory more than in paper. Epidemics and lean harvests left marks that can be seen later in village relocations and in the rebuilding phases that archaeologists describe in walls, hearths, and reused stone. Cultural continuance was explicit. Ceremony resumed in plazas. Languages held without mission schools. Winter count motifs and later ledger art fixed memory of cords runners and the siege. Stories anchored to places taught children why certain beams in rebuilt rooms came from church roofs and why a kiva's ladder faced a given way. In 1692, Spanish forces returned under a new governor. Entrances to some towns were negotiated, others were fought. Even where Spanish rule was restored, the exact pre-1680 order did not return. Pueblo ceremony remained more secure. Local councils retained leverage formed in the years of independence. That continuance reaches into the present at Ohkay Owingeh and other pueblos, where language ceremony and community governance persist, and where the revolt is remembered as survival, made concrete in water walls and words. Scholarly consensus holds that the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 was a coordinated indigenous movement that expelled Spanish authority from New Mexico for 12 years, reset religious practice on Pueblo terms, and changed the framework of any later Spanish return. Most historians agree on the structural drivers: long suppression of ceremony and governance labor drafts tied to mission and civil orders, and drought stress in the 1670s produced a shared resolve across many languages and valleys. The communications method of runners and knotted cords transformed that resolve into simultaneity. At Santa Fe, the decisive act was control of water. The cutting of the acequia forced the capital to empty. Contested points remain. Casualty totals vary by source and by place. Participation was broad, but not uniform across towns and valleys. The scope of Pope's authority is debated. Spanish examinations and later narratives name planners and messengers, while Pueblo memory emphasizes local councils acting under a shared signal rather than a single commander. Numbers reported for friars, colonists, and Pueblo fighters carry differing levels of confidence. Archaeology at Chemes Zuni and the Hopi mesas helps mark building phases and the reuse of mission stone and kivas, but material timelines do not answer every question in the papers. Fact and folklore touch at the edges of the cord story. The countdown is documented in declarations. Later embellishments about miraculous signals are not. The enduring legacy is threefold. First, the revolt stands as a case study in region-wide indigenous coordination, adapted to distance and diversity. Second, it secured cultural continuance. Ceremony language and local governance resumed and persisted even after a Spanish return in 1692. Third, it reshaped colonial practice. Any later governor in Santa Fe had to reckon with Pueblo autonomy and with the memory of a capital emptied by control of water and roads. The event endures because it made survival tangible in shared signals and in restored places, and because it proved that a coordinated indigenous choice could redefine power along the Rio Grande. Thanks for watching to the end. In your view, what was the decisive factor of the revolt? Religion, forced labor, drought, or control of water at Santa Fe? Pick one and say why in the comments.